Right. Okay, we are going to call to order the Town of Telluride, Colorado Special Town Council meeting. It is Wednesday, January 29th, 2025. It is 1:02 p.m. and we have people in the room in Rebecca Hall at 113 West Columbia, and this meeting is also hybrid and online. The first thing we have to accomplish is the roll call. We will start with a roll call with people in the room.
Geneva Shawnett. Ashley Von Sprecken.
And Teddy Erico, the mayor. And online, we also have Piper, if you could fill everybody in.
Me and Elena.
Fantastic. That brings us to agenda item number 1, work sessions, gondola project transition to station area planning in the Oak Street Station. We will have this presentation and it will come in multiple parts, and there will be breaks in each of the presentations from the team that will enable us to have public comment. We will request that public comment, whether you're in the room or online, is restricted to 3 minutes or less, but we will do the best we can to accommodate as many questions as we have to make everybody feel like they've been listened to. And I'm going to hand off. We've got many members in the hot seat, and Amber, I will hand it off to you to make all of the introductions.
Thank you, Teddy. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having us. My name is Amber Kyle Blake, and I am the project manager for the gondola project, and would like to take this opportunity to introduce the rest of our project development team. For staff and consultants.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. This is Miles Graham. I've been facilitating the long-range gondola planning effort since 2021.
Pete Williams with SE Group, doing the gondola specific subject matter.
I got to really lean in. Ed Parks, I'm with AECOM, and I'll be the project manager on the consultant side.
All right. And then we have a couple of other folks on the internal staff team. And since with mics, I'm just going to introduce who they are. So we have David Averill, who's the executive director of SMART, Jim Loby, transportation director for Town of Mountain Village, leading the gondola, and then Connor Ingram, who is also part of the gondola team up in the Town of Mountain Village. So that is, for the most part, our internal staff team. Working on project development. And today we are looking at taking project development and then moving into station area planning. So this is really a transition meeting where if you were imagining running a relay on a track, we are now handing the baton over to the Town of Telluride team to run station area planning. And then we will come back and we will hand the baton back to the project team, and we will integrate the station area plan into the rest of the overall gondola project. And that's, I guess, I'm hoping an easy visual to understand how this is working. We're going to talk about it in detail, how we got to where we are today, and then where we're going. And that's what our presentation is. So we'll get started here. Let's see if I can get this to move. All right. So our agenda for our meeting is to start out with some gondola history. We'll move into project development goals. We'll have project development status. And then we're going to look at the transition between project development and the station area planning, the nexus between the two, and what's going to continue happening on the project development side as station area planning is in the works, because we're not putting the rest of the gondola project on hold. And then we're going to get into our timeline and our next steps. So just a little bit of background and for all of you, I'm sure this is a review, but if not, we think it's really important to understand the timeline of the gondola. I know the few of you in here were here in Telluride in 1982. Or not born yet. I was 3.
88.
You're 88. Oh. Well, your family lives here.
Yeah.
So San Miguel County approved the Mountain Village development with the gondola requirement to mitigate traffic and air quality impacts. And that happened way back in 1982. And then 10 years later, the construction of the gondola began. In 1996, the gondola opened to the public. And in 2018, we hit 3 million annual riders. This is a pretty incredible number. And it's important to be able to look at this because we are working with the Federal Transit Administration. So when we look at this in terms of public transit, why we like to highlight this is the gondola runs as many people, provides rides to as many people as the Colfax BRT in Denver on an annual basis. And that is something that makes people think twice, especially when we're talking to folks in an urban area about a rural system. And then the other thing that we like to highlight here is in 2025, we hit 140,000 hours of operation on the gondola since it was installed. And this is remarkable because it's more operating hours on one gondola system than any other comparable system in the world. However, I also want to point out that the gondola is still very safe and it is running in great working order thanks to Jim Lobe and his team. But 140,000 hours is a lot of hours. So it's ready to be replaced. We're also forward looking as the gondola committee, the subcommittee, the leadership team, constantly forward thinking of saying, where do we want to go and how do we want to get there? Some additional facts and figures. The gondola has been in operation for over 25 years. It's the first and only free public transit system of its kind. And the majority of the current funding comes from TMVOA with contributions from the town of Mountain Village and Telluride Ski and Golf. That's for the operations and maintenance is TMVOA at this point. It's one of Colorado's busiest transit lines. Like I mentioned, it has the 3 million plus trips a year and over 20,000 riders a day during peak periods. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. When we look at the increase in ridership since 2011, it's been a 33% increase in ridership. And when we look at other public transit systems, this is also a remarkable statistic in looking at how much the gondola provides service and alleviates traffic congestion and improves air quality. So when we get into why we are so excited about one of the things we're so excited about the gondola and makes it kind of an outlier in terms of public transit, we look at the ridership decline for public transit nationwide post-COVID. So if you're looking at this chart, APTA, the American Public Transit Association, provides national trends on public transit ridership. So we can see the big decline from about 200 million trips a year nationwide on public transit. COVID hits and we go down to below 50 million trips a year. You can see that, we stayed pretty flat throughout 2020. When you look at the far end of the chart and we're looking at the number of lines 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, and 25, you can see that there's been about a 74% return to pre-pandemic levels of service ridership. When we look at the gondola has returned to pre-pandemic ridership numbers. It is one of the few systems, if not the only system, that has fully returned to those pre-pandemic levels. And we continue to see an increase in ridership year over year. And that is really important because folks are using the system. They will continue to use the system. And with the ridership forecast our team has done, we're projecting that the system will continue to see an increase in ridership. And why that's important is because of capacity. And the primary driving factor for one of the transit grants that we're looking at is capacity. So capacity it's a core capacity grant, and that is part of what makes you primarily eligible for that funding source. Does anyone have any questions about history of the gondola? That was your history lesson for the day.
No questions from council. For my online council members, any questions?
Awesome. Okay. So now we're going to get into the project development goals. So why are we here? What's the purpose of the gondola project development? So the gondola subcommittee and gondola leadership committee have come together and they've identified goals for the project. One of those goals was to identify and establish long-term operation and maintenance funding for the existing gondola system that connects Telluride to the town of Mountain Village. The second goal was to replace the aging gondola infrastructure that lacks capacity to keep up with future demand. Important to note that this is with the caveat that we minimize transit downtime, which means that the goal for us right now is to, when the gondola is actually constructed, that downtime for the construction is one summer season. So that will minimize impacts. And then continue to reduce traffic congestion and environmental impact by continuing to provide reliable, free public transportation through the gondola as an option. When we look at capacity, the 4th of July is a really great example of when we hit beyond the beyond of capacity on the gondola. So the 4th of July this past year, we saw over 25,000 riders. This was more than 500 riders than we had in 2023 on the 4th of July. The wait time in 2024 was more than an hour, up to more than an hour and 45 minutes. And why we look at capacity is because when it's not, let's say, this specific event where you're trying to get to town from the village for the parade, if you have capacity issues day after day at certain time periods, you will typically see a shift in mode. So people will choose to drive their car rather than to take the gondola. They choose a different mode of transportation. Yes.
And I know this is the extreme example, but
Mhm.
the actual timeline that people will choose not to wait in the line and choose to ride their car is actually shorter, right?
Much, much shorter. So when we look at, and Pete's going to speak to this in a minute, but when we look at capacity, when we have more than 600 riders per hour, we see that capacity impact. Really, if you're waiting for more than 15 to 20 minutes, folks are going to turn around and choose a different mode of transportation. And if you don't know that you're going to have to wait and account for that extra 15 or minutes or so into your commute, then it has negative impacts. And then that mode of transportation may not necessarily work for what you need to do in your life, which has other ancillary impacts like parking and on and on and on. So I'm going to transition this over to Pete, and he is going to talk about the forecasting and capacity data that we have.
Thanks, Amber. Yeah. So as Amber was just mentioning, the hourly capacity of the gondola is around, give or take, 1,000 people per hour. But due to misloads and all the other kind of stuff, once it's somewhere in that 600 to 700 people per hour range, then you start to see lines. And lines just, mathematically form whenever their demand is exceeding that hourly capacity supply. Same with any ski lift or gondola. And so we don't have a slide for that, but I have the numbers here. In the 23-24 season, the gondola experienced 50 days of crowding, meaning when there were, significant lines that were formed, with 137 total hours of possible time when lines were being formed. So far, 2024-25, there have been 35 days with 133 total hours of possible line formation. And so what we're looking at on the screen here is using the visitation data that we were showing on that slide earlier that Amber was showing. There's about a 3 to 4% trend line of increase in ridership. And so we kept that going and then actually flattened it out after a few years to about 1 to 2%, just with the assumption that it can't continue to grow that much forever. It just limits to how many people are going to be there. And so that's the projections that we're showing here. So by 2050 and then 2060, using all those same parameters and the same data that were on those previous slides, you can see anything in red represents a day when there would likely be a line. And so if you were to look at the current ones, of the full year's worth of data there's only going to be that 50 days or whatever of red. Whereas on this one, you can see virtually all days at that point, right, would be showing lines. So, yep. And then this is the projected, those numbers, the total annual ridership numbers that would be projected using that same data and trend lines. So you can see those going up quite a bit. Yes.
Does anybody have questions?
Does anybody on council have any questions up to this point? And then Amber, do you want, at what point do you want me to start to engage the public to see if they have questions at this point? I know we have some people in the room and some people on Zoom. I know that this is informational, so there's not going to be probably not much feedback quite yet, but
Right. And if there is someone that has a question right now about the data, I think it would be useful to answer that question now to make sure that the answer that we are able to answer or provide additional information. Then we'll get into decisions that were made to date, and then it'll be the next section that's really.
okay. I just want to make sure the public
Okay,
knows
thank
that
you.
we're aware that you guys will have questions for the team and we will get to you.
Go ahead.
Okay, well, we'll jump into some decisions to date before we enter into what the station planning process is going to look like. And on the next slide, like all good decisions, the decisions that were made in the long range planning process for the gondola were not made in a vacuum. Here's just a quick snapshot of a few of the metrics that have tracked our outreach and engagement to date. There certainly are more than listed here, but as you can see, thousands of survey responses, 44 meetings of the gondola subcommittee, which meets monthly, and 15 meetings of the Gondola Leadership Committee, which is comprised of the council from the town of Telluride, the town council from Mountain Village, and the TMVOA board of directors, as well as the board of county commissioners, and the SMART board of directors and the leadership from Telsky. So all told, those 44 subcommittee meetings and 15 leadership committee meetings are about 60 public meetings total since 2021 on this process. We've also gone and made the rounds with all the local governments and the governing bodies, and many stories in the media and reports published on this effort. So as a little framing to some of the activities to date, as I said, none of those activities were made in a vacuum. And when you look at this timeline, it may look like the decisions made to date were very intentional, very linear, and they were, but I don't want to not mention the amount of work that the local governments and the community did throughout this process to get where we are today. It involved a lot of hard work to find our common ground community values and use that common ground to work through all of the trade-offs, and there were many, and get to a place of compromise, which brought us to where we are today. So in short, going back to 2021, going back to the value drivers and what community values really produce the ideal positive outcomes we want to see from this system in the future. And that led us in 21 and 2022 to look at our options, everything from doing nothing to an entirely new system. And pretty quickly, doing nothing came off the table. And that's where the group really looked at, if we did a minor upgrade to the current system, and as you heard from Amber, that system has more operating hours on it than any other comparable gondola in the world. And every day we run it, we set a new record. So the minor upgrade came off the table pretty quickly, and the risk associated with the major upgrade and the cost benefit also took that one off the table in the spring of 2022. So that's when we decided a new system best meets the needs of our communities. And later that year, the leadership committee, at the recommendation of the gondola subcommittee, unanimously decided that a regional approach to our new gondola is the best path forward. And so that would be bringing the gondola system as public transit with over 3 million riders a year, which rivals RTD's busiest transit line in Denver, under the SMART umbrella, so that it would be operated and maintained and funded similar to the existing regional transportation functions in the area. So that brings us to where we are today. In January 2025, obviously, we understand what our O&M assumptions are going to be for this new system. And through the ballot initiative last November, passed a local funding plan to cover those operations and maintenance expenses going forward. And then we began to understand what the future system capacity needs to be, which brings us to station planning and where we are now, which begins the hard but exciting work of thinking about, for each of our stations, what do we value as a community, and what's the vision for the future when we're thinking 10, 20, 30 years in advance. So with that, on the next slide, there are some of the capacity recommendations that have come from the leadership committee that Ed's going to walk through in terms of the specific size and functions of the new gondola, and always making sure we're minimizing that construction downtime, as Amber mentioned.
Thanks, Miles. So this next section, I'm going to take half a step back. We're going to talk about, go back to that last one, Amber.
Oh.
Half a step backwards and talk about like what we decided here. And then we're going to get into the heart of how station area planning is going to happen in 2025 and how the town of Telluride is going to be working on that, how Mountain Village is going to be working on it, and how our gondola project team is going to be what we're going to be working on at the same time. So this is where it gets rather dense in material. So I'll work my way through it. And if you guys have questions, please just let me know. But so taking the step back, 2024, this is what our leadership committee really agreed to. And we came to a decision on what design elements we wanted to see in the gondola. So that included having 10-person cabins to increase that capacity, having the level boarding and the ADA accessibility to also help the smooth the operations of the gondola, which will also help us with capacity. In terms of construction, as Amber mentioned, we want to look at minimizing our downtime. So that was really a focus of when we start working with the vendors a bit more, for them to understand like this is a priority to make sure the gondola is only down for hopefully one season, or maybe we phase it, looking at that to be a key driver. And then that initial capacity of 1,800 to 2,000 people per hour. As you heard Pete talk about before, at 600, you're seeing lines. So now we're increasing it by this much capacity per hour, and that'll be an initial design capacity. And what that means is the gondola stanchions, everything will be built, and the adding of capacity will be just adding new cabins onto it or additional cabins onto the line. So when you have a final design capacity of 2,500 to 3,000 people per hour, that's a future piece where we can add in those elements later. Yes.
I just want to amplify that a little bit because this might be a little bit confusing for our listeners. And it was something, being on the gondola subcommittee and then also being in leadership, that like I got a lot of times to touch it, to understand it. So the big thing is like, you know, we saw all these really large projections about future growth and future usage, but the new system that we're going to build is going to definitely be able to facilitate what we have now as our maximums. The nice thing that I liked about this was that this also allowed us that if we didn't see those huge increases, it wouldn't change the system at all. We would still have a system that was purpose-built for what we need today. And then incrementally, as that need presented itself, we could add just cars to the new system to increase that as we needed to. It's not like we have to build the system today to meet future needs that are 25 or 30 years down the road. So this system, the new system, would be built for to definitely capture the capacity issues that we have now, but it wouldn't be built all the way out or even need to ever be built all the way out if we didn't see those huge changes in capacity that are projected. So I just wanted to make sure that that was clear, because the current gondola it is maxed out on its capacity. There is no way to add, you know, more gondolas to make it faster, to do anything with the current system. And that's why the new build was really enticing, especially for, you know, even over the major change or the major infrastructure change. So I just want to amplify that for everyone.
Yeah, that's really helpful, because it is like it's a quick thing of 5 dot points that has a lot of background to it. So thank you for that. Let's go on to the next slide. So 2025, this is really what we're going to be focused on. Our core team, the 4 of us here, are going to be focused on in the gondola project development. We're going to be looking at the program implementation schedule, the federal funding coordination, like Amber mentioned about, talking to FTA, figuring out like what we could be eligible for. A nuance that Amber may explain later in Q&A is that this team and you all have been really critical in lobbying the FTA to understand that this is a transit system and making it eligible for that. So that's why it's critical for us to talk to them and it's going to be a bit of an education campaign of working with them, because they haven't done gondolas before. So that's where we've got this whole coordination and not just like we're going for grants. We want to be working towards our capital funding plan. We also want to be looking at smoothing out any easements and agreements, and then eventually, hopefully, getting to these bid documents and getting to start working towards drafting things that we can put in front of our vendors so they can build and respond to us and say, yeah, that makes sense. We can start locking in some things for the future. In addition, the team's gonna be looking at the San Sofia station. There, we're looking at the maintenance facility concept design, so really just understanding where we could put a maintenance facility up in that area to make sure that Jim and his team have an ability to take some of the cabins offline, work on them up at that station. Part of that's gonna have a public process, so we're gonna work on the conceptual cost estimates for that, making sure all those things are pulled together. So that's what this team's gonna be focused on in 2025. As we move into our project goals, what I want everyone to understand is the difference between the two projects, right? So our project's really focused on this increasing capacity. We're looking at the federal funding, and we're looking at the like-for-like replacement in terms of defining a baseline of what is going to be in for that transit system, and we're looking to minimize that downtime. Town of Telluride and Mountain Village, you're going to be looking at the station area planning, defining a vision for your station and understanding what that looks like while aligning to the gondola project development goals. And that's kind of the critical part. So the gondola is always going to be that key factor. You need to make that be successful. And then that other pieces are going to be complementing the functionality of that system. So that makes sense to everybody before I keep going here. So another way to talk about it is like this organizing principle here. You have the baseline transit function, you have the minimizing the transit downtime, we'll seek transit funding. On the left, you have that us as the gondola project development team. You've seen us in red, station area planning in blue. Anything else that's going to be overlapping between the two teams, that'll be in purple. We can keep moving from there, Amber. Another way to think about it here, if you look from the top bar, so us, the red team, gondola, and the terminal, the blue team's been working on the terminal and the station area. So when you look at the requirements for the gondola project team, transit function capacity, ADA accessibility, that's us on the gondola subcommittee. And then you all are be looking at the additional amenities, potential transit-oriented development, ADA accessibility, and like that's going to be your local jurisdiction responsibility. What you decide that's going to go above and beyond what we're bringing to it is going to be your responsibility as well. That's going to fit in the purple, and we'll get to the purple here in a second. So defining the boundaries and the definitions. Same thing at the top, gondola and terminal. We're looking at those baseline transit functions, looking for like replacement of the system functionality. We're looking to increase our capacity and make sure we're having ADA requirements throughout. And the station area planning teams are working at the terminal and the total station area. That's going to include any amenities. So you can add shops, restaurants, bicycle facilities, multimodal connections, the landscaping, et cetera. How we basically would be approaching the terminal. If you think about it from a pedestrian point of view, how you walk up, what you see, what can be there, how that action happens. Those are some of those amenities we're looking at. The TOD opportunities, that's something you could look at, whether you wanted to add office or potential housing, hotel, whatever, potential adding there. And then having the ADA requirements always being cut throughout both projects. Does that make sense? Everyone following? Okay, cool. So the purple. I'm not going to go into the red and blue again because it's kind of explaining what we just talked about. But the purple is the nexus between the two projects. And I think that's what's kind of critical to understand. You're looking at the ADA, the lighting, the video surveillance, adding these elements in. So emergency telephones, wayfinding information, any of the station amenities to make those things coordinate and can overlap into any potential federal funding eligibility. And that's where we're looking at the purple items. The above and beyond items for Town of Telluride would be looking at these items in blue. So those would be your responsibility in terms of scoping and any future costs to those items. Good so far?
Yep.
Cool. Yeah, go ahead. Okay, focused on that station area development. So what we're trying to do in terms of looking at the entire program is take this programmatic view for all of the projects, and this will build to a future slide. So as you saw before, we were in red, these are the blue. So there's going to be these 3 station area planning efforts, 2 in the Mountain Village and 1 here in Telluride. Those core elements can be focused on the 20% design elements. The public process is going to be continued throughout with cost estimates. And really, the way we've talked about this quite a bit is you want to be defining the puzzle pieces a bit more as we kind of build in 2025. And as those puzzle pieces get defined, we're going to come all together and have one holistic view of the puzzle and having that picture and be like, oh, okay, that's how that all breaks down and that's how that all fits together. And you kind of get to see it in a broader view. So move on to the next one. So the timeline and next steps, and this is where that programmatic viewpoint kind of looks at it. So in 2025, you have essentially these 4 efforts or 5 efforts happening all at once. You have the gondola project development in red. We have the Mountain Village station area plans for both the Village Center and the Market Plaza area. Then you have the Telluride Oak Street station, and then you have the San Sofia maintenance facility. So all of those things are going to be focused in 2025 to define those puzzle pieces and have them come together so we can look at it from a capital funding planning point of view and from a design point of view. So our timeline to achieve this. So the red, we have the gondola project development always moving through. We have this next bar, which is the red and blue, where you have the station area planning happen. So those are both going to have their public processes, and then we're going to have those 4 projects moving throughout. And really what I want to, if you take anything from this slide, is the dotted line in sort of the July, August timeframe. That driving through is where we get to see how the puzzle pieces come together, and we start to see how our federal funding evaluation comes together, and hopefully how our program comes together and our capital funding planning comes together. So by the end of summer, we should be having a whole programmatic view of what this gondola project looks like and how it impacts both the town of Telluride and Mountain Village all in one. I'll pause for there because that was a lot. Any questions on that?
No. Okay, we will encourage any public comment on anything that was presented up until this point. If there is anyone in the room that has any questions or comments for things discussed to this point, you're welcome to step up to the soon-to-be replaced microphone. And please feel free to do so. As we remember, as we go through this presentation, there'll be other opportunities to speak as well. So this isn't a one and done kind of situation. Seeing nobody in the room. Great. First, I want to make sure that we have no public comment in the room. Okay, great. Then we will go to online, please, Piper.
Michael Saffler, I've asked him to unmute.
Great.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Michael.
Oh, thank you. Great. So I heard mention a number of times about some type of federal funding. That's the first time I've heard of that. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on what that is all about. Also, when we voted on 3A, we didn't vote for a new gondola or new stations. We voted for improving and maintaining the existing gondola, and that does not sound like what you are discussing here. So how does this tie into 3A? And the consultants that we're hearing from today, who's paying for their work? And I realize that you all have had a lot of meetings, but please keep in mind that the public doesn't really know what's going on. And I'm not sure that even though you've had all these meetings, that you all even know quite what's going on yet.
Michael, thank you very much for your comments. I will defer to Amber to answer your questions.
Hi, Michael. Amber Blake here. So I may need to ask you to repeat some of those because that was a pretty stacked question, and I want to make sure that I'm answering your question. So this is what I heard. Your question relates to federal funding, what federal funding are we looking at? You have a question around 3A. Yes, you are correct. 3A was operations and maintenance, long-term O&M funding for the gondola. Within the question, there is an allowable use for anything collected in the first early collections before 2028, when SMART would begin paying for O&M expenses with the 3A funding to be used towards gondola project development and capital expenditures. And then, so those are the two pieces that I caught on to. The two pieces I don't have a way to write down your question. So Geneva.
Question was who's paying the consultants?
And who's paying the consultants? Okay, so I'm going to start with who's paying the consultants. So there is an intergovernmental agreement between the project partners. This intergovernmental agreement has been in place this is the third year. In 2023 and 2024, the IGA was split between the town of Telluride, the town of Mountain Village, San Miguel County, and Telluride, San Miguel County, TMVOA, and Telluride Ski and Golf. And that IGA was in place for project development costs for 23 and 2024. In 2025, there has been a shift in funding partners in the intergovernmental agreement to pay for project development costs, which is the consultant team and staff that are running the project development process. The three partners that are in place for 2025 is the Mountain Village entity, which is the town of Mountain Village, and TMVOA. Between the two of them, they are splitting at 12.5% of the cost each, for a total of 25% of the total project development costs for 2025. The town of Telluride is paying 25% of the total project costs. And then SMART will be the third funding partner at 50% using 3A funds for project development. Now, this is going forward to the SMART board in a resolution at their next SMART board meeting. So that has not been finalized to date, but that is where we are today for 2025 funding of project development costs. Do you have any questions about that piece?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Is it true that $1 million has been spent already between the parties based upon the IGA agreement?
Not quite. There's been approximately $1 million that has been spent.
Ah,
I can get the actual number. I'm sharing my screen, so if I go into my screen to go try to find it, we'll lose the PowerPoint presentation.
that's okay. $1 million.
Over 3 years. Over 3 years.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the 12.5, 12.5, 25, and 50 you just mentioned, that's above and beyond the $1 million that's already been spent?
There is approximately $900,000 that is budgeted for 2025. Yes.
An additional. And wow. And the 50% from SMART that you just mentioned, is that that money is going to come out of the 3A money? But we're talking about gondola planning, a new gondola plan, and that's I don't read 3A to have authorized that spending from SMART. I heard your interpretation of it, and I just reread the language, and I can see how you conclude what you conclude, but I don't believe that's what the public thought they were voting on.
So I appreciate that. We did seek legal counsel to ensure that that was an eligible expenditure under the ballot language before the SMART board continued their conversation on that. So just, it's not my opinion, it's the legal opinion. I just want to verify that.
It's a legal opinion, yes, not the legal opinion.
It is the legal opinion that we have from our bond counsel or from our legal counsel.
Okay.
And Michael, I want to make
Thank
sure
you.
we answered your other questions
Right.
too.
So we need to get to the other questions. So then I'll start with federal funding. So over the last 3 years, there have been discussions at the Gondola Subcommittee and Leadership Committee meetings related to identifying federal funding sources for the capital projects, so the reconstruction of the gondola, new gondola system. And there are 2 federal funding sources that have been identified where gondolas would be eligible. The first funding source is a raised grant. It's through the DOT. And there's a maximum cap on that grant of $25 million. It's an 80-20 match. So the local entities would need to come up with $5 million to match that grant. That grant is an option. It is on a standard grant cycle. Historically, the grant cycle has had a call for applications in February with a notification of awards for successful projects around June. If this project were to seek a raised grant, if it was the best opportunity for us, we would be looking at potentially not the 2025 grant cycle, but the 2026 grant cycle. With this funding, really the FTA, the DOT have been looking at a raised grant program as being the closer. So you would need to have all of the other funding pieces in place, and it would be the last bits of funding to close out the project to ensure the project could be completed. We still have information that we need to collect and a whole lot of additional work that we need to do before we know if that is the right funding source. The other funding source that we're looking at, which Ed mentioned earlier that I had referred to, gondolas are newly eligible as mode of transportation under Public Transit Administration grants. So there's a program called the Capital Investment Grant Program, and it's the core capacity section of that grant program. This is not like a standard grant. And the way that this program works is when you are ready and you have a project that meets criteria, you request entry into the program. There are 3 stages of the Capital Investment Grant Program, and it's basically if you were imagining that you were running a race and you had to hit certain checkpoints. So you have to complete X, Y, and Z, and then you hit the next checkpoint. So if we were allowed entry into the CIG program, we would be allowed entry into the project development phase. Once we went through project development phase, the next checkpoint, you receive approval into going into the engineering phase. After the engineering phase, you get a full-blown grant agreement and you get into the construction phase. One of the differences with the Capital Investment Grant Program for core capacity, which we would be seeking, is that any funding that is spent before entry into the program is not eligible or considered local match or eligible for reimbursement. So that is where the timeline starts. So if we are entree into the program, let's say in January of 2026, any funds spent on project development after entry into the program then are seen as local match or eligible for reimbursement per the grant program. This grant program historically has been approximately a 50-50 split local match federal funding. So if we had, and I'm going to use round numbers here, $100 million project, we would require 50%, $50 million local match and receive $50 million of federal funding for eligible expenses. So this would be anything that's in the purple area and the red area of that Venn diagram that we looked at. Anything in the blue area would be considered not eligible because it's above and beyond. And so that would be the blue area. If it was related to station area planning, then it would be the responsibility of the locals. So if it was the Oak Street station, it would be the town of Telluride, responsible for those costs above and beyond. Being that this would be the first gondola project that is in front of FTA, we are currently in coordination with them and having conversations because we want to make sure that we all are on the same page with what metrics we use for being eligible. So what does capacity look like? Capacity issues on a gondola may look different than capacity issues on a bus rapid transit line or a regular bus line. So these are things that we're working through with the FTA. There will be future gondola projects after this one that they receive. We know there's a number of other municipalities and entities out there that are looking at gondolas as public transit. So that's where we are today. Do you have any additional questions on the federal funding question.
Sure. Do you think the FTA is going to be in existence in the next month?
If she knew that, Michael, she wouldn't be sitting at the table right here. I mean,
Yeah, well, I've got a feeling it's not going to be, but nonetheless,
we can only address the concerns that are in front of us now.
I
We
understand.
can't
I
predict the
understand.
future.
I fully understand, but we are projecting the future. That is what we're doing here today.
When I think that being said, Michael, if the Federal Transit Administration doesn't have funding, then we're looking at a funding program that is SMART and the local entities. And that would be a locally funded project. And that is definitely something that we are evaluating and looking at. So it's on the table. It's one of the options, and we're not taking it off the table because we want to be ready for any situation that comes at us in the future.
And the station costs you mentioned, you said those are above and beyond what Smart's going to be funding. That there might be additional costs to the town of Telluride for any improvements we wanted to make to the station in town.
So Michael, and this is Teddy, the mayor speaking on that. Basically, what we are tasked with the town of Telluride is that the gondola transportation system is exactly that. It's the gondola transportation system. If we want to have just a shell around it or no shell because technologies have changed, we can choose to do that and spend very little money except for ADA access and some other transportation links. And so now we're looking at all the opportunities to try to make that base area at Lift 8 in the current gondola the best it can be going to the future lifespan of this new gondola if and when it happens. And that gives us the opportunity to have a blank slate to throw out ideas for anything we want, like that was discussed earlier in the presentation, from restaurants to storage, bike storage. You could do office space, you could do affordable housing, you could do other housing. There's lots of things that you can do. Anything that we do is based on what the town of Telluride wants for our jurisdiction and what the town of Mountain Village wants in their jurisdiction, and maybe a little gray area at San Sofia Station. And so there's no responsibility for a transportation initiative to pay for stuff that the town, with plenty of public input, will deem what's in our highest and best use for what we ultimately decide. And there have been no decisions made at all and nothing really concrete that was laid out. And that's a huge reason of why we're here today.
And the expense will be ours, the town of Telluride.
If we choose what we choose to do outside of the gondola system and what we
I
ultimately
understand.
choose to do, that's correct.
Just like everything else.
And the land is owned by the town of Telluride or Telluride Ski and Golf?
I don't have the map in front of me, but the town of Mountain Village certainly owns a big chunk of that land. Amber, you might be able to, or Zoe.
Yeah, it's majority of it is the town of Mountain Village. There is some right of way that is currently the town of Telluride, but we will be working hand in hand with the town of Mountain Village to look at a 100-year lease option or other options to ensure that that land is used for the town in the future.
And one thing I didn't mention that I want the public to hear, part of what we think will also be making sure we envision how that drop-off area works. And will there be a second lane that makes drop-offs a lot easier? We all know the base of Lift 8 and the gondola is a very disorganized and congested area. We couldn't foresee its growth 35 years ago in the planning, and it is what it is now, but we may have an opportunity to fix that to alleviate congestion and make the town of Telluride a smoother and better functioning town at that pressure point currently.
And can I just clarify a little bit further? You said the town of Mountain Village and not Telluride Ski and Golf, is that correct? Owns that property or part of that property?
That is correct. Yep.
Okay,
And
thank you.
thank you so much for your
Michael, thank you very much for your comments. We really appreciate your contribution to the discussion. Piper, is there anybody else online? Great. Seeing that there were no questions in the room and no other questions online, we will keep moving forward with the presentation with Amber.
Well, that is the end of the presentation. Um, So we do have a QR code here. So if you are on the virtual meeting, if there are comments that you would like to submit that you just wanted to provide, but you'd rather provide in writing rather than speaking them, please feel free to use the QR code to submit your comments. And if you are interested in receiving information and updates about the upcoming station area planning process, this is a great opportunity for you to provide your contact information. And in the comment, just say, we're interested in being on the contact list. And all of the comments and information will be provided to the town of Telluride. So if there's no other questions,
I'm going to reopen it
Yeah.
up because I want to make sure. I'll be honest, I didn't realize that was the end. I didn't see the thank you slide up there. But that I want to make sure because, throughout this discussion today, I wanted to make sure that everyone knows that they do have a chance to be heard. So if someone was holding on to a question, thinking we had a little bit more, or there might be a little bit more discussion that opened up other questions, we certainly will encourage that right now. We want to make sure everyone that wants to be heard can be heard. But as Amber said, there's other formats to be heard, and we will certainly well publicize our meetings moving forward. So there's other opportunities to chime in, not just today. And so with that being said, I will first reopen it to questions in the room. If there's anyone who would like to step up to the microphone. Peter, since your hand, I saw that one first.
Peter, while you get settled, I just want to jump in as well and talk. No, go ahead. Go ahead. I'll be super quick. Just about future communication and making sure everyone is aware. So I know this is starting to get complicated. We will still be having through SMART our gondola subcommittee and leadership meetings, which they publicize. So we'll make sure if anyone's interested that you are signed up for those lists. And then as the town moves forward, specifically with our station area planning, we will have a specific engage page through our town website that you can sign up for if that is of your interest. So you can sign up for both or just one, however you want to cater that. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity for public input.
And can you state your name for the record, please?
I'm sorry. My name is Peter Loomis, and I am the owner of Welcome to Telluride Vacation Rentals. The point I'd like to discuss is more around the funding of the gondola project. And that is that the short-term rental community, which I'm a part of, well, we would like to request a Zoom meeting with the Department of Revenue for the state of Colorado. Because the voters, as we know in 3A, when they pass that, there's an additional percentage that's going to be paid by the visitors, those that are renting doing short-term rentals. And we, as a collective of companies that are in this business, need to collect this tax and pass it on to the Department of Revenue. We do have a problem. And the problem is that the Department of Revenue states that all reservations starting January 1st, 2025 must collect this percentage for the smart tax. We can't charge this tax retroactively. So if you think about it, we have signed contracts that were 6 months ago with these visitors, a year ago, whatever. And we can't go back to these rental guests and say, we know that you were here in January, but you really, we know we have a contract with you, but we would like the county to get 2% of whatever the rental amount was. Or whatever percentage it is. What I'm trying to say that this is very difficult to do, to go back to people and say, that contract that a contract is a contract, right? And to be able to go back and handle that and say, so let's just put in perspective. The last 5 years, we've had a number of short-term rental taxes that were implemented. they were not retroactive. This one is retroactive. So it makes things very difficult for us to do this. And what it should be is what it has been with the town of Telluride, and that is that any contract that's signed on or after January 1st should have to pay the tax.
Yep.
So that's my point. Thank you.
Peter, the point is very well taken. And Amber, do you want to, or David, do you want to, I think it's important to address it.
sure.
I want everyone to know in the room and listening that it's a smart tax and not a town of Telluride. So the town of
Right.
Telluride,
It's also, yeah.
you know, it's
It's
not.
a smart tax that's administered by the Department of Revenue.
Yes,
To be,
exactly.
very clear. We're here loud and clear, Peter. Thank you for your comment. I do believe that the smart board will probably entertain doing that Zoom call. We've had a few requests for it. So stay tuned for that. I think, and we'll, as I mentioned earlier, we won't do that without a representative from Department of Revenue there to hear the concerns directly and hopefully give some good guidance for us. But hopefully we can get some sort of resolution. I don't know what the future holds there. I can't promise anything, but we'll definitely start that conversation up. Yep.
Great. Is there any additional public comment? Please step on up to the microphone, state your name, please, for the record. You might have to tilt that microphone down a little bit. Sorry, we want to make sure our listeners hear.
Fine. My
Hear
name
ya.
is Nancy Landau. Good afternoon. I have a lot of confusion about the costs and where they come from. And I understand that municipalities pay for the station that's in their vicinity. So is that money that will be required to do whatever is decided upon? Is that coming from 3A funds, or will there be additional seeking from townspeople more money to build that?
And I'll try to, yeah, we'll try to answer. If you have multiple questions, we'll try to answer them in order so we remember them and give an answer while it's still fresh for the listeners to know. And we'll hand, Zoe, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I know we have 3 minutes for public comments. So I just want to make sure that we're being useful of the time. So I can write down your questions if you want to do it one by one and get them all
I
out.
basically have two. They're
Okay,
kind of-
perfect.
it's
Yep.
both about funding.
Okay, so for the station area planning, and I don't know if it's helpful to pull up that Nexus slide there, but you're specifically talking about the beyond the just like-for-like infrastructure for the gondola. So anything above and beyond what we are discussing for replacement of our current gondola system. To Teddy's point, this is our time to envision what we can really do to enhance that space. So we don't really know exactly what that cost will look like as we go through that planning process. However, as the town looks, as we do for any infrastructure that we provide to the community, we have a lot of different financial or funding sources that we can look at, such as what we call COPs or other bonding mechanisms. I think your particular question is, will we be coming back to the voter base to ask for more money? That is not our intention for the station. We want to make sure that it has its own revenue sources potentially in its own way, but making sure that it is a cost neutral build and something that we as a town can take on from a debt perspective, and not to ask the community to go above and beyond what we've already asked for in that sense.
Can you talk about 3A just real fast, just address how the funding from 3A works
I can do
and where it goes?
So then, so for 3A, the funding is set up so that 80, I want to get the percentage right, 87.8% of the revenue generated in 3A goes towards the gondola. The other 12.2% goes towards smart services and service expansions. So there'll be two separate funds. So they're in like a lockbox, so to speak, for what their uses are. So if you look at the gondola revenue that is generated from 3A, those funds will be, what they can be used for is the funds are being collected starting this year. And then the gondola operations and maintenance agreement with TMVOA ends. So they are no longer paying as of December 31st, 2027. So starting January 1, 2028, those 3A funds will be used for operations and maintenance of the gondola. In the early collections is what the term that I'm going to use. So between now and January 1 of 2028, Those early collections will be used, one, to create a fund that has at least 1/4's worth of funding for operations and maintenance funding. So you've got your funding set aside, so you're ready to pay for the bills starting in 2028. The other piece will be as the smart board will need to look at, like, what do you want as a reserve fund for set aside? So what is necessary to have in the reserve? And then money on top of that that's collected can be used towards the capital project. It would be just money towards the capital project. It is not debt service. The 3A question was not a debt question.
And again, it's very specifically toward what we're calling Project A, the gondola project, which
So-
is separate from the stationary.
Stationary. So anything in the red and the purple can be used. So anything within the red circle can be 3A early collections money that can go towards capital can go for the red circle only and the purple piece. But if you just took the red circle.
Very difficult to see from
Yeah.
back here.
And
Right,
there is
and
in the
we
back of
do-
the room as well.
And
Okay.
we have a chart in the back of the room. Sorry about that.
Didn't notice that. Okay. good.
So the project A, does that,
And I can sit down. I know it can be,
I know,
sounds complicated, so I'm happy to sit down further.
Yeah.
If you would like a little one-on-one time as well.
how can we clarify?
So when you say gondola, you mean,
Gondola system.
when you say system, it's the towers,
Mhm.
the cars,
Mhm.
the cabling,
Yep.
but it's not the station.
This is where it can get confusing. So if we were going to replace the gondola system with terminals or shelters, like what you currently have down at Oak, when we walk into the line and then you load and it's in the little heated area that has the tin walls. If we're there's a bathroom down there as well. So all of that would be included in Project A. If we're just replacing a basic station similar to what the station is today, that's Project A. If, for example, the visioning came up with a 2-story facility that had mixed-use development, the gondola station, as well as maybe some commercial and a residential unit on top, anything beyond the section that is the gondola piece of that and the public restroom, because that's what's here today, would be above and beyond. That would fall in the blue area. So that would fall that would fall in the town of Telluride.
And we don't have to do any of that.
Mhm.
That's what we're doing here today, is we're talking about, okay, what is our vision as a community for this space? Because we have a plan in future years that the gondola needs to be replaced, and there's going to be an opportunity for redevelopment. We could sit here and all decide not a thing will change. We could sit here and decide we want to revitalize this whole area and change it, 10 times over. That's our decision as a community and with our leadership to decide for ourselves. So that's literally what we're doing today, is starting that conversation.
And
Setting up.
Yes,
Setting-
starting
Yeah.
the
Next meeting.
conversation so that we can,
Say, I want a McDonald's in the station, or I want lockers, or I want.
Scratch that from the record.
the point is that's what we get to do
Yeah.
with our station.
And basically, to help clarify, there's basically 3 separate things that have separate funding. For the gondola stations, that will be the responsibilities of those applicable governments to decide what they want to do. That's one pool of money if you choose to go that way. And as Zoe said, we're trying to make that cost neutral. Then there's the cost of 3A, which is primarily the operation of the gondola starting January 1st, 2028. There's some leeway with what the funds can be used that's collected in advance of that. That grays it a little bit. And then the next pool of money, and we haven't started that, it's part of the timeline, is the overall cost to replace the gondola. So there are 3 distinct and pretty separate items that will all have different funding mechanisms based on how we decide to go. And with station planning, we have an idea we don't have an idea of what we're going to do, but we know the funding's going to have to come from the governments. And then in terms of the capital cost, it's still too early in the game to decide what the cost is, who pays what funds we get federally to help us, and on and on and on. It's too early to commit to anything. And then 3A has set the table, which on another note is hugely advantageous for us moving forward with the capital replacement, because you're not going to get any federal funds and grants if you do not have that O&M agreement in place. They're not going to fund something that has the ability to fail. And so we already made really positive strides to move forward.
So the second question about funding also would be, if no federal grant comes to fruition, then
Yep.
Go ahead.
where does the money come from?
Yeah.
'Cause
So
the table for a lot for 3A, which actually, when I reread what the ballot said, it did not say replace the gondola.
no, and
It said,
But those, the operations and maintenance doesn't start
Hold
for
on,
us
like-
until that agreement with the Mountain Village ends.
Right, with TMVOA.
So that's
which
the whole
original-
thing, is that money, starting from that day one, all it will be used for on the 2028 is then that's used for operations and maintenance. That's what it's used for, because we are gonna have to keep the gondola up and running, whether it's an old gondola or a new gondola, we're responsible for keeping it up
after
and
3
running.
years more.
So the 3 years is where we get I call it, the nest egg. That's where we don't have the responsibility to pay and maintain and, keep people going and all of that. We get that money. That's what now the SMART board, the gondola subcommittee and gondola leadership now get to decide, okay, we have this pot of money that isn't earmarked because we don't have those financial responsibilities on our plate yet. What is the best use of those funds? We talked about a reserve fund. We talked about, hey, we have to take operations on day one of 2028. We need to be able to pay those bills. So we need to have that money already set aside. We already know some of these things. And then the other money is what we can use to help plan for the future replacement of the gondola. And that's what we're trying to do right now. It doesn't mean that after 2028, we just get to keep that money thrown into replacing the gondola. We actually will have to pay for the gondola at that point.
And actually, there is no sunset on our funding 3A. Isn't that
Correct.
right?
Well, because there's no sunset on the gondola. So that's correct, that it is indefinite as long as it is transportation for the governments.
But right.
There's no sunset on the
But if it
tax.
gets built and then the 3A funds, let's say it gets built anew, and then afterwards we are maintaining, then we've got this very large tax burden that we're continuing to pay, which after, let's say it gets built, then it's only for maintenance, but we don't.
No, we have to
Operations.
pay to operate the gondola every year going forward.
Right, but it's not going to take the funds to build it. And so.
want me to?
Yeah,
think a
maybe,
lot of
I don't,
folks are-
because I don't think I think we're still missing each
So-
other.
That's why I tried to break it into the
Okay.
3 different pools.
Okay, so I can help with this. So, and Mian, do you want to jump in and then I can?
No, I was trying to jump in just to answer the question specific, but Amber, if you want to go ahead, that's great.
Okay. So when the gondola subcommittee and gondola leadership committee agreed upon the amount of money that would be seeking in revenue for this tax, right? So
3A.
for 3A. The $8.2 million was based off of existing operating and maintenance expenses, looking at moving into the future, knowing that there's going to be inflationary costs. And so $8.2 million a year will cover operations and maintenance of the new facility or the existing gondola. And then there will be about $1 million that will go, or so it would be 7.2 million for the O&M of the gondola and about $1 million that goes towards smart bus services. So that number, if it's going to cost $7.2 million for O&M in 2028, there's no money left over for anything else because the primary purpose of 3A is operations and maintenance.
Or maybe Jim can jump into and draw out what's included in operations.
Yes.
It's not just something broken, I fix it.
Right.
It's paying all the staff. It's all of the energy. It's
Yes.
heating the spaces. It's like how to make it run. It's not just, oh, a month in, we need to fix something and that's that expensive, but it's just the full operating of the business.
What it
of
costs.
of the machine.
Right. So it's like if you have and Jim, if you want to jump in, you can, but it is paying for the staff, it's paying for their benefits, it's paying for the facilities, the maintenance of the facilities, the maintenance of the machine, any capital replacement expenses, like you need a new haul rope every 10 years. So every 10 years we need to buy a new haul rope. So you have your capital equipment replacement plan, It will fund all of those things. It'll fund all of the staffing. It funds the system. That's the O&M. And that's the only money after 2028 that exists to run the system. Because at this point in time, with the way that the federal government spending is set up for rural transit, we're not looking at any sort of subsidy coming our way to run the gondola. Not a substantial one. Like maybe minutia compared to.
And in addition to that money, this is also the deal that we're working with Telsky right now to get their 4.5% on their ticket sales to go directly to also help with the funding of the gondola. And that's their contribution to that. But that's the pot of money that we get to run the gondola with.
And their contribution varies from year to year on ridership. Is that my understanding?
It'll vary with
Yeah,
ticket sales.
that's right.
So
Varies
they're-
on their ticket
they're-
sales.
They're elastic. Their contribution is elastic. And
Potentially.
taxpayers down here is not elastic.
Well, it's elastic in that the same way that sales tax are elastic, the same way that property
And Meehan
values are
has her
elastic.
hand
So
up. You wanna
Ashley's,
jump in?
I think Ashley's answering most of it. I think one of the points too about the Telsky funding is that because it's not specifically earmarked for operations and maintenance or for capital, it does allow, and nor is it actually dedicated solely to the gondola either. It's funding for SMART as an organization. It allows us to be more elastic with what those funds are being utilized for. So they can be utilized for a variety of different elements to whatever transportation project they're necessary to fund, now and in the future.
which is useful because it's a lot of times you get money, as we know, and it's very specific on how you can spend it. Having funds that are more liquid allow you to, be able to fund a variety of projects or a variety of things. So it is useful to have it that way.
Can you also mention what the estimate of that annual?
The low end estimate on that is $1.5 million.
Of their 4-point-something%.
That's their 4.5 on their ticket products.
So it's just occurred to me too, sorry for taking so much time, but if their contribution is on ticket sales for skiing, do they have any contribution for all the summer visitors, or is it just winter season?
It's based on their ticket sales. So just to give you a little bit of a background about how we've gotten to this deal with them right now. The previous deal that they had, they paid 1% of just walk-up day ticket sales at the resort. So they were paying about $250,000 a year in that. So obviously with everything going on, we were like, you need to have a larger, skin in the game. All of our data had indicated that about 20% of the ridership was for Telsky use. That's the Angle Station exits and all of that. So that was how we utilized that to come up with what would get them to that 1.5. We're hoping it'd be more. I'm going to say $1.5 million. That represents of that 7.2 cost, 20%-ish of that cost for operations and maintenance. Now, this is what we're hoping to get with them right now. It's a huge increase from what they were paying. So this is kind of like our first step with that. I don't know if Meehan wants to talk more about it, but we were excited to have an increase from $200,000 to $1.5 million because that's what they were contributing previously to this agreement that we're working on with them.
And all their businesses are, of course, subject to the same sales
Sales
tax,
tax.
property tax, short-term rental tax, or excuse me, lodging tax, for all of their businesses as well. So in that way, their visitors will also be paying into the total SMART tax collections.
And I don't know if it's worth mentioning, just like recognizing that 70% of the original gondola was paid for by Telsky. That doesn't, we've got the machine today, it's getting replaced, but we wouldn't have it without that.
And this is Miles, one other clarification on the ridership at Angle Station. I've confirmed with Jim and his team, it's 10%.
So 10%.
Are we helping to answer your question?
A bit, thank you.
We can also, any of us, I won't speak for everyone. I'm happy to sit down and talk with you more in depth and maybe if I can one-on-one or show you or whatever, it's one of those things that's like sometimes talking about it, I feel like complicates it a little bit more than if you just kind of if we sat down and had like just a straightforward conversation. I want to have the conversation because I feel like it's something that the public, there's some confusion in the public because it is complicated.
There is.
But we're gonna figure out how to like make this easier to understand and not have to go to 14 meetings to understand it.
And I think that the point of this first meeting is exactly that, is just to try and level set base facts for us all to start to build these conversations on, so that the public does understand the funding structure that we have, what the funding goes to specifically, and how we're bringing this project forward for everyone.
And if you have strong feelings about the base stations, please, those are
Okay.
gonna be fun meetings, I think. Fun for me anyway.
Interesting, like that's where we get to have like,
Because we make up a
Dreams.
vision of what we think it should be, and if everybody hates
going,
that
"What?"
idea, we should amend that, or there's things we haven't thought of. So I think that there's real ways that we can do changes to the way the station is now that are really beneficial to locals specifically. And I want to make sure that, at least my goal is to maintain focused on that for the Telluride station, because it is such a hub for
everything.
Yeah.
things.
And to be clear too, we're gonna have to deal with lots of land ownership, easements, all kinds of things for what that ultimate blank slate looks like, because it really will be a blank slate.
And we are limited by land that we can utilize to create amenities for the community, and the opportunity to get access to develop potentially more things in such a central area of town that are beneficial to the community is one that we can't just ignore and say we should just, keep it the same and not even worry about it because we don't want to spend more money on it. We have to evaluate what could go there and how to pay for it, and maybe our dream of what we want to put there, we decide we can't afford it, and so we adjust. But that's what this next round of meetings is all going to be about.
Appreciate your time. I do know that from talking to friends of mine who voted, that they didn't have an understanding that voting for 3A meant replacing the gondola because of the ballot wording that said maintenance.
And there,
And I think there's a lot of that needs to be
that's right.
understood and
And Mian
But-
has her hand raised.
Yeah, I want to be really clear about that. Everybody that voted on the ballot question for 3A voted on funding operations and maintenance of the current system and the new system ongoing into the future, as well as a carve out for ground transportation through SMART. That is what they voted on, and that is, so if there is any sort of misunderstanding in regards to that, I just need to be explicitly clear, that is what the money is going to be collected for. That's it. And so like, this isn't, yes, we have to replace the gondola, but that was not, it wasn't as though we weren't talking about the gondola being replaced during that conversation. The ballot language was specific to operations and maintenance, and that is what those funds are going to continue to go forward towards.
All right. In the blue book that we got to help us understand how we would vote, there was nothing on the right-hand page where anybody could get an idea about why would this not be a great idea. It was all positive, and the right-hand page was negative, which was a confusion to me because I always go to that book and I try to understand the issues. And I think a lot of people have a concern why wasn't there
Who publishes the blue book? I know.
We'll let
State.
Dave, do you want to take this?
Yeah.
That's I think you're referring to the Tabor Notice Blue Book, where we're required to put in comments that were if you will, that were received by SMART. We did not receive any negative comments to put into the Tabor Notice, which is why that was blank.
when would they have been called for?
I don't remember the exact dates off the top of my head,
Yeah.
but I mean, everything we did was within lines of the Secretary of State's requirements and the timing. That's been borne out in the facts. So I don't, besides just stating the fact that we didn't receive any negative comments, that's why the Blue Book didn't have any negative con statements in it.
I think the timeline was super short, and people were caught unawares when they tried to learn about it, and there was nothing for them to read. So comment from not just me, but friends I've been talking to who did vote. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Is there anybody else in the room for any public comment before we end this meeting today?
When's the next?
Let me double check to make sure we don't have anyone with their hand raised online. Piper, can you double check? Okay, that's great. And so, item 7 is the next steps. And Amber, do you want to take,
Well, so there's two
multiple
next steps. So I will pass it over to Amber to really continue on. Again, the point of this meeting is this diversion that we are starting to have currently, which we will then come back together for that puzzle analogy. So we have 2 opportunities for next steps. So I'll let you take
Okay,
your
great.
next steps first.
Thank you. So the next gondola subcommittee meeting is January 24th. That typically we go the third Monday of the month, but due to the holiday, the leadership committee agreed to move that meeting to the following Monday. So February 24th at 3 p.m. The agenda and link to that meeting will be posted on SMART's webpage. So if you go to SMART Gondola Project, you can Google that and it will just pop the right page up. There will be a link and the agenda on SMART's webpage, and that'll be posted about a week in advance.
And now, since we've had this meeting, the town's really excited to move forward with our station area project. We'll be working with our consultants design workshop. We are finalizing our task order after this meeting, and we'll have our first community engagement opportunity and public meeting to come, and we'll make sure to communicate that widely and often for the public to know.
great. And before I adjourn, I want to make sure that I thank everyone who was in attendance in the room and attendance online and chiming in with public comment. That's the only way we're going to, create the best system possible for us and the best path moving forward, especially with our gondola station in town, which is really exciting. And seeing no other comments from anybody, I will adjourn this meeting by mutual consent. Thanks, you guys.
everyone.
Thank
Appreciate
you
it.
very much.
I'm not on it. Gosh darn.